across to our guests, Dr. Anand Ranganathan, author, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations, Dov S. Zakheim, he's a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and vice chairman of the board for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and Nikita Mendkovich, director of the Eurasian Analytical Club. I want to start by asking you, Ambassador Mukherjee, for the layperson, the talking points we've heard are aplenty. One, it is about being a counterweight to China. It is also about trade. But for India, what should be the main aims for the next 2 days? What are our interests from this summit?
Well, I think the aim for the next 2 days is, as the Prime Minister announced when India took over the presidency of the G20, is to give the voice to the developing countries of the Global South, to focus on the priorities of these countries, which is today codified in Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. The Prime Minister has said that India's development is aligned with Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. And I think that these are the priorities for India, and these are the reasons why India's presidency of the G20 is actually designed to support not only the achievement of these objectives for India as a country, as a developing country, but also for India's leadership of the Global South, a process which began in January this year with the virtual summit of 125 countries held in New Delhi, hosted by our Prime Minister, and which has now set forth a series of initiatives which have been considered by the G20 in its sectoral meetings, which have taken place in India over the last many months. And if you look at this canvas, then the very fact that over 200 meetings have taken place of the G20 in 68 cities of India, 100,000 delegates from G20 countries have participated in these meetings. I think these numbers speak for what has been India's biggest push into the G20 agenda, which is to democratize the agenda, to make it relevant for people, and to make it, as the Prime Minister says, human-centric.
Ambassador Mukherjee, but what does it really mean in plain speak to be the voice of the Global South, and how does India gain from it?
Well, what it means is already evident for those of us who live in the Global South. In the area of climate change, we have set up the International Solar Alliance. We have focused on the Biofuels Alliance, which is an agreed pathway for the G20 at its meeting of the environment ministers a few weeks ago. We are moving towards a transition from fossil fuels to environmentally friendly fuels. So that is one big area where the G20 means something and where it is giving results. The second area, and that is a unique Indian contribution, is in the use of digital technology for development. There are very few countries in the Global South, and very few countries even in the G7, who can match the scale and scope of the use of digital technologies, which India has done since 2015, which has made for an inclusive and accelerated development process. So I think that this is the second big area where it makes a difference, where people feel it in their day-to-day lives. Even the delegates coming from the G20 are going to have their wallets, e-wallets, digital wallets available to experience for themselves how this works. So this is something that is important. And of course, the most important is to bring in, as the Prime Minister says, other countries who have been kept out of the G20. The countries of the Global South, starting with the African Union. And I do hope that at the end of these 2 days, the G20 will agree to make the African Union the 21st member of this group, which will bring in 54 developing countries of the Global South in one stroke. Thank you.
In that sense, Dr. Anand Ranganathan, when again and again India says that we want our presidency to be, and I quote, inclusive, decisive, ambitious and action-oriented, they are reiterating their position that the old world order has to change and everyone who is deserving must get a seat at the table.
Good evening, Padmaja, and a very warm welcome to the delegates to Bharat, the land of eternal Sanatan Dharma. There are a couple of issues that I'd like to delve on, especially because I just caught that phrase that you uttered, and I think that's going to be, or should be, the nub of the deliberations that go on for the next couple of days, action-oriented. How can India ensure that things are no longer the diplomatic speak, as they say it. Allow me to be a little bit more cynical than the other panelists, perhaps, because I'm not a diplomat. But there are two issues I'd like to, because those are the two issues that are very dear to me, and I dare say I have reasonable amount of interest or expertise, you can call it, in those. And I think those are the two issues that I believe, away from people would talk about Ukraine and diplomacy and all that, but I believe these two issues are the ones that India must enforce action. And these two are global health and climate security. So please allow me a couple of minutes, because I think these are the two things that I think the West is at loggerheads with the South, so-called South, when it comes to both these issues, and we've seen it in front of our eyes in the last 3 years. So as far as global health is concerned, I think we need to approach it with a sense of shared vulnerability. And global health governance is something that is absolutely important. We need to collaborate. We need to invest in strong health systems. The disparities in health outcomes, the co-investments in building a diverse and skilled health workforce to serve the global population, and strengthening health systems so that they are capable of effectively responding to health crises, as we've seen, and meeting the healthcare needs of populations. Now, according to WHO estimates, there could be a shortfall of 10 million healthcare workers, Padmaja, by 2030, 10 million, largely in the South or developing world. What are we going to do about it? What is India going to enforce? Action-oriented stuff as far as this is concerned. Disparity in access to healthcare, easy access to affordable essential vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, tackling emerging threats. That's so important. Antimicrobial resistance, pollution-related, AMR or antimicrobial resistance could claim more lives every year, 10 million, than the COVID pandemic did in the past 3 years, nearly 7 million. We have a need for a pandemic accord, a pandemic treaty under discussion, strengthening global health security to prevent outbreaks and pandemics with one health surveillance is absolutely crucial. Now, just a minute, maybe less than that, on climate security, because that's another thing that the West and the non-West or the developing world is at loggerhead. Look, the Global Climate Risk Index, or CRI, Padmaja, classifies India amongst the top 10 countries most vulnerable to climate events. India was ranked 7th in the 2021 CRI report. Approximately 75% of the districts in India are identified as extreme event hotspots, while around 40% of districts have shown a significant shift in weather patterns. Prime Minister Modi, you would remember, those, I think 2 years ago, he promised renewable energy capacity of 500 gigawatts by 2030, 500. That's incredible. Even West hasn't promised it. Today, our capacity is 170 gigawatt. A huge chunk of this has to, Padmaja, come from nuclear, because if you remember, one nuclear power plant powers 700,000 homes and emits less carbon dioxide than a hybrid car. What is the West going to do about it other than scaremongering? We have to really get together and, as you said, action-oriented. So these are the two things. I can talk about the other thing, development goal, financial inclusion, data, but I'll leave that to tomorrow. But these are the two things that I would like my expert fellow panelists to talk about: global health and climate security and action-oriented events.
But also a lot of concern, Mr. Zakheim, is about whether there will be a joint statement. To your mind, what is the likelihood of that happening? Because there are competing interests and there will be competing demands made on India as well.
Well, I think there will be a joint statement. I hope you can hear me.
Yes. Loud and clear.
Thank you. There will be a joint statement, and I think it'll be there for several reasons. First, as the previous speaker said, I think there's a growing consensus in terms of not just climate, but in terms of the West helping the global South on climate. And I think President Biden in particular, and I'm not a Democrat, so you can take it that this is really the case. I give President Biden a lot of credit for pushing the climate change issue, for reaching out to the global South. I think that the Europeans as well are recognizing that they have to do something. Now, India, of course, has to do a lot. It's almost as bad as China in terms of generating carbon, and that has to be dealt with. But I think there is a consensus, and I think it'll show up in a communique. So that's one. On global health, you got to remember, we're leaders on this, we, the United States. The PEPFAR, which President Bush, George W. Bush started, has saved millions of African lives in particular. And of course, our vaccines, as opposed to those produced in China, actually worked. So again, I think you'll see a lot of support from the President of the United States on this issue. I think he's on the same page with Prime Minister Modi. Obviously, they've had a bilateral. There's a lot of cooperation in the military and security fields. Everybody knows about that. But on the G20 level, and I think it will be G21, all indications are that the African Union will be accepted. I mean, after all, you have a European Union that's part of the G20. That will be a big victory for Mr. Modi. He's been the one pushing this. And finally, and very, very important, look who's not there. The Russians aren't there, and Mr. Xi isn't there. Now, Mr. Xi represents himself as kind of the leader of the global South. Well, it's nonsense. We all know how the Chinese really operate. They take over everything, and then they lend money, and then they basically extort the countries they work in. There's a huge opportunity for India to take the leadership of the global South in a serious way. And with the Chinese economy on the rocks right now, and probably exaggerating how well they're doing, which is actually much worse than the reality, I think India, with its population, with its growing gross domestic product, with its global reach, this is a huge opportunity. And I think that at the end of this G20, you will see that India has literally moved up to the next level as a global leader, with, by the way, I think total American support.
But you spoke of two absences. Dr. Ranganathan, I'll just come to you. Give me 30 seconds. You spoke of two absences. What about the second one?
Well, Mr. Putin, I think that what Mr. Modi and the G20 are going to do is avoid Ukraine. There may be some, some statement, some vague statement about it. But I think India is trying very hard. It's got a relationship with Russia. You can't deny that. And that's not going to go away overnight. I think that the military relationship that really made India dependent on Russia, that's changing. I think the sale of American drones, $3 billion worth. More important to me is the cooperation on producing the General Electric engines and technology cooperation. 5 years ago, this didn't exist to that level. 2 years ago, it didn't exist. But nevertheless, India does have a relationship with Russia, so it doesn't want to get caught in the middle. And my guess is that for that reason, and remember, India is not the only country that's at the G20 that feels that way. You've got Brazil there, you've got others. I suspect that they'll try to sort of circumvent the issue so as to make this a productive G20 as opposed to simply a food fight that will accomplish nothing. That wouldn't help India at all, won't help anybody, frankly.
Okay, Dr. Ranganathan wants to quickly come in, but I really must go across to Mr. Mendkovich after that because Russia has been spoken of. Yes, Dr. Ranganathan.
No, just very brief couple of points because the very erudite Mr. Zakheim, although I agree with a lot of what he said, he ended up giving a couple of wounds to us. So can I please rebut him on those 2 points? Number one, when he talked about America is doing a lot and it must contribute and help India in the greenhouse and the climate change, can I please tell him that the greenhouse emissions per capita for America are 20 tons, whereas for India are 2 tons. So we are the proud signatory of Climate Accord, Paris Climate Accord, even though it's going to hurt us being a developing country. So I think we are very well placed in taking this further and helping the world much more than America is. And number two, as far as Mr. Zakheim saying that we are global leaders as far as vaccine is concerned, can I also please gently remind him that it is the Pfizer vaccines of America that are under huge scrutiny, whereas our vaccines, we managed to vaccinate 1 billion people within 1 year, twice over. Extremely safe. Thank you so much.
Fair. Mr. Mendkovich, everyone seems to...
Numbers.
Everyone seems to be on the same page.
I won't waste viewers' times, but let me tell you, as an economist, you're playing with numbers. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Mr. Mendkovich, everyone seems to be on the same page, India and the West, when it comes to China. Russia, though, not quite. What are your expectations from the joint statement?
I think the biggest problem of the G20 is the spoilers of this organization. This format was started to discuss international problems, healthcare, ecology, other international problems. But the now problem is that United States and Great Britain and European Union are spoiling international trade. They started economical war against Russia and China. They are baking anti-Russian aggression and war in Ukraine. These actions of United States makes impossible a good international trade and good international cooperation. Even now, when people came to India to discuss the current questions, United States and British want everybody to back those aggression against Russia. They want to mention those efforts to occupy, to slave Ukrainian people and Russian people in the international declaration. It's absolutely unacceptable. They are acting as if they were slave owners and other nations are the slave. You see, Biden is infected by COVID, but he's coming without a medical mask. I'm afraid that the first question we should discuss in India is how to put a dog mask or a muzzle on American face to stop American aggression, to stop this threat to international right and international security. The biggest problem now to discuss is wars started by United States, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine. Every nation, every country, every man in the world are in danger because of American ambitions, because they want to see other nations as slaves who lives like Washington orders them. It is unacceptable.
Mr. Zakheim, would you want to respond to that? The speaker from Russia is of the opinion that the US and UK trying to push their agenda in the G20, those days are over.
Well,
and it will be resisted.
I cannot sit back, and I don't think anybody else can, to listen to such outrageous lies. Lies, L-I-E-S. Who invaded who, for God's sake? Last time I checked, the Ukrainians didn't invade Russia. The Russians invaded Ukraine. Who was killing men, women, and children? Oh, it wasn't the United States. No, excuse me. You spoke. I am now speaking, so you shut up, please. No, you be quiet.
Okay, gentlemen, Mr. Mendkovich, I'll come back to you. I'll give you the opportunity to respond. Please, sir. Yes, go on.
This is absolute lie. The Russians, by the way, you guys invaded Georgia as well. You're in a number of other countries, but you invaded Ukraine. You tried to seize Kyiv. You've been attacking the whole time for a year and a half. You thought you would take over Ukraine. You don't even want to admit Ukraine is an independent country. And every one of the countries attending this, including the 54 countries that are part of the African Union that will be part of the G20, fully understand what it means when another country attacks an independent sovereign state. So you may be on Mr. Putin's payroll. You may be echoing the same things he does. Well, obviously, if you don't, they'll throw you out of a window or shoot you in an airplane. But the fact of the matter is, all Russia has to do is stop invading Ukraine, stop its so-called operation. You won't even call it a war. You have to call it a special military operation. You're like George Orwell's 1984. You cannot tell the truth.
Okay, let's tell our viewers we're getting the first pictures of the meeting between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi. Mr. Mendkovich, I'll give you the opportunity to respond, but it's hardly any secret your differences with the United States of America, but you'll appreciate India's position in taking a fair ground when interacting with both countries. Let's focus on India's position and its presidency of the G20.
Okay, we should discuss an India position. India was a British colony for centuries. You fight for your freedom and your independence. The same situation is now when Ukrainian and Russian people fighting against American occupation and against puppet regime in Kyiv, controlled by United States. Your American guest telling fairy tales, blaming Russia in aggression, but we are just fighting for our freedom. It is self-defense. So if India wants to keep the independent, want to see world free, you should support Russia and Ukrainian people in fight against American aggression. They are killing people. They started the war. They invaded Iraq, Libya, Ukraine. There are a lot of graves of American soldiers fighting against Ukrainian people in so-called Ukrainian army. They get to our land. They want to make us slaves, as India was for centuries. We have the same task to fight for our freedom.
Now, Ambassador Mukherjee, one can imagine that these strong views on both sides are pretty symbolic of what America's and Russia's concerns will be during the summit as well. How then do we expect to have a joint statement?
You're asking me?
Yes, Ambassador Mukherjee.
I'm not inside the negotiations, but I think as a person who's dealt with multilateral negotiations in the past, I would just like to make 2 or 3 points. The first is that even as late as yesterday on board Air Force One coming from the United States to India, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told the press assembled on the plane that the G20 is the premier forum for economic cooperation. Right? Now, if that is so, then I, as a person who spent a fair number of years in multilateral diplomacy, cannot understand the logic of a non-economic issue being brought into the discussions of the G20 as a forum of economic cooperation, except perhaps if there was an economic dimension to this issue of Ukraine. And I find that from the media reports, there are 2 things that are, in a sense, missing from these reported discussions. The first is the failure of the global forum for political issues, which is the United Nations Security Council. Now, if we are to look at Ukraine, then we logically have to look at the failure of the Security Council, and logically we'll have to support Prime Minister Modi's call in 2020 and onwards thereafter for a structural reform of the United Nations Security Council. That is the core of the proposal of India for reformed multilateralism. Now, that has been missing from all the reports of discussions on Ukraine so far. The second point is that the United Nations is a multi-dimensional organization. It has politics through the Security Council, but it has also got economics and human rights through the Economic and Social Council and the Human Rights Council. So why don't we also look at the way the Ukraine issue has been dealt with by the Economic and Social Council and the Human Rights Council? And there are 2 resolutions which I find are missing in this discussion. One is December last year, the General Assembly voted a resolution outlawing the use of unilateral economic measures, like sanctions, because they have an adverse impact on developing countries of the Global South. And the second is a Human Rights Council resolution voted in March this year, which again says that any economic restrictions imposed because of conflicts have a violation of human rights, especially of developing countries. So when we talk of this Global South, we have to bring all these issues into the picture. But I find that in the reports of the discussions that have taken place, neither Security Council reform nor the illegal nature of unilateral sanctions is ever mentioned. And we seem to be going on a script which is completely divorced from the world of the multilateral institutions which have been created. So these are the points that I had in response to the discussion that was going on Ukraine. Thank you.
certain issues seem to, for maybe because of headlines that dominate, seem to overtake the actual agenda of G20, which, like you rightly said, is ultimately an economic agenda. Dr. Ranganathan wants to respond. Let's tell our viewers that this again are the first images. The meeting between the Prime Minister of India and the President of the United States has just begun. Yes, Dr. Ranganathan.
No, I just wanted to say a couple of points on an issue on which I'm not an expert on, hence my eagerness to make a point on those, which is this quite visible aggression shown by both the Russian as well as the American expert. Well, the American expert, Mr. Zakheim, is quite right in castigating Russia. But, America telling off other aggressors is a bit like Osama bin Laden castigating Hafiz Saeed for perpetrating terrorism. I mean, here is America that's destroyed half the world over the last 50 years. You remember the Iraq and WMDs? You remember what the state of Afghanistan is currently? That said, one needs to ask Russia that because it warned and principally went into Ukraine because of the NATO imbroglio, is it next going to invade Finland?
Okay, I suggest we steer the discussion back to what is happening right now, which is the meeting between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi. Ambassador Mukherjee, your expectations from this meeting, the main agenda items.
I'm sorry.
Ambassador Mukherjee, what are your main expectations from the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Joe Biden?
The U.S. India meeting going on right now, I think there are two big expectations. One is it's in the bilateral setting, the transfer of technology agreements that have been announced and are to be processed. I think that has two components. The one component which is probably proceeded further is the sale of technology, the sale of the equipment from the United States. But on the transfer of technology, which is the second component, I think there are still negotiations which are due. That's one set of issues. The second set of issues was actually identified by the U.S. Finance Secretary, Dr. Yellen, whom we saw in the photograph just now, and that is the need for taking some leadership role in a very big component of the G20 agenda, which is on climate change. And there has been an obstacle in the sense that multilateral institutions, multilateral banks have not been able to provide the financial flows to support some of the initiatives that have been taken in the climate change agenda. So in this meeting, whether there would be some focus on how India, United States, and the World Bank, for example, can work together to ease the flow of funds required for climate change through a discussion. The third, which is reported in the American media, not so much in the Indian media, is a connectivity project linking India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel through a railway link. And I think that that's a very interesting proposal because one is that it would provide an alternate to the Suez Canal route, which is currently used, and which is the major route for our partners in the European Union, who are among our largest trading partners. The second, of course, is with the outreach between India and Egypt, what would bypassing the Suez Canal mean? Or would Egypt also be included in this initiative? These are the points that I think are the 3 points that I can identify which would be preoccupying these discussions.
Mr. Zakheim, there have been a considerable opposition to America's deepening ties with India, including within the U.S. Congress, especially when Prime Minister Modi was hosted by President Biden just a few months ago. And despite that, there have been more than a dozen either in-person or virtual engagements between the two in just the last 2 years. Why is it? Is it because of the China shadow that America is forced to deepen its ties with India and especially with the Modi regime?
Well, let me try to deal with that. I think we've been reaching out to India, let me put it this way. My first visit to India was in 1981. We've been reaching out to India for many, many, many years. And it seems to me that obviously China is a factor, but it's only a factor because we and India see the world very much the same way when it comes to what China is doing. So in that regard, yes, there's a common denominator, but the denominator goes well beyond China. The fact that we're both democracies is not a trivial issue. That's number one. Number two, the fact that there's a very large and very successful Indian diaspora in the United States is also very, very important. Remember, our vice president has Indian ancestors. And so that tells you something right there. And then the third thing is on fundamental issues, we really do agree. Climate change is one. The expansion of the World Bank, Mr. Biden's administration has talked about strengthening the World Bank, giving them more power to do exactly what the ambassador just talked about. So on climate change, there's a very, very common view as well. Global health, a common view as well. And so it's not just military cooperation. It's not just China. It is a sense that we and India really see a lot of the critical economic issues. I'm not talking political now. I'm talking economic. As an economist, we see a lot of these economic issues in very much the same way. Yes, there's concern in the Congress, but you know what? There's concern in the Congress about just about everything under the sun. And the fact of the matter is that Congress, in general, is supportive of what this administration is doing, because working with India, frankly, is a bipartisan approach, not just one party's approach or another party's approach. And that's very important, because if you look back, we've been reaching out to India no matter who the president was. You think back to President Bush and President Obama. And, so I think you see something here that's much deeper than what some people think is on the surface. And I think you're going to see that by the time the G20 is over. And I think that's why this meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, which, as has been pointed out, is one of many, many meetings and phone calls that have already taken place, is so important for not just the G20, and not just for the bilateral relationship, but generally for the globe at large.
Dr. Ranganathan.
I wholeheartedly agree with the previous panelists. And just to add to that, I think one good thing that has happened, Padmaja, over the last decade, certainly under Modi, that the U.S. is now a vital trade and security partner. Unfortunately, because historically, our foreign policy was shackled by obsolete Nehruvian thinking. We have had a cagey relationship with the USA, but things are on the bend. 34% of Indian stock market assets are American investments. Indo-US trade has surged from $16 billion in 1999 to $170 billion now, double of French-US trade. NASA and ISRO are now partnering heavily. We have nuclear reactors together. Energy is one sector where both nations are looking to trade and collaborate heavily. So we have sent more than 200 American satellites into space. So more power to this Indo-US cooperation. And I think G20 final declaration would have a reflection of this partnership.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Thanks very much, all gentlemen, for joining us. What is going to happen? The joint declaration is going to be key. Everyone's going to be parsing every minute detail of it, but all of those deliberations will take place in the one venue that is the centerpiece of this entire summit, the Bharat Mandapam. What went into the making of the Bharat Mandapam? What is inside the Bharat Mandapam? We give you an inside look.